happen. So just to give you a brief overview of what I intend to talk about today, but I would love to hear whatever questions you have beyond these topics too. I'll just give you a little bit about my background so you know what I'm doing here. I want to talk about an introduction to pesticides and pesticide laws in this country, and just an overview of the pesticide registration process and the risk assessments that are conducted prior to registration. And a look at how these risk identifications show up on pesticide labels, which are our instructional documents when using pesticides in the field. I wanted to, I added a little bit to my presentation based on a conversation I had with Carol the other day, a look at how POSAC or Boulder County could approach herbicide use decisions on public land. And then I just wanted to reiterate steps that should always be taken to reduce the risk of pesticides. So I have a bachelor's degree in environmental science from New College of Florida. It's been in the news a little bit lately, but I don't want to talk about that. And then I got my master's of agriculture with a focus on pest management at Colorado State University. And I did this alongside Peace Corps service. So it was kind of a weird master's where I spent some time on campus and I left for 2.5 years to live in the middle of nowhere. And then came back and defended my thesis. And anyway, so it was a very interesting experience and pretty formative for me, as a matter of fact. And then I worked for about 5 years at the University of Idaho's Integrated Pest Management Program. And then I moved to Reno, where I worked at the University of Nevada, and also in the Integrated Pest Management Program. And there I was doing mostly like weed education, early identification of weed species to prevent, widespread, prevent them from being widespread, because early detection is important in weed management. And about 12 years ago, I took a job at the University of California with the statewide integrated pest management program, but my very, very specific focus in that role was to be the pesticide safety educator. So if you could just imagine the size of the state of California, the number of people that are there, the number of things that are grown there, the number of pesticides that are applied there. It was kind of a big job, and so I got to really focus in on educating people who are using pesticides, either in their home life or in their occupation, and also helping supervisors and employers do a better job at managing pesticides and worker safety. And a couple years ago, I took a job as faculty in the Department of Agricultural Biology, in the same department that I graduated from quite a few years ago, and also sitting in the same office and with the same phone number. So it's good to be back. So I just want to start with an introduction to pesticides. I recently had this experience where I sat on a panel and we were talking about glyphosate, and one of the people in the audience came up to me afterwards and she said, well, we're talking about glyphosate and that's an herbicide, but you kept saying pesticide. And so I thought I just need to take a step back and make sure that you know what I'm talking about. So pesticides, as a definition, they're substances, they're chemicals. The intention behind applying them is to kill a pest, and a pest is a living organism. And we get to determine what we think is a pest, but that's the basic definition of what a pesticide is. And herbicides are a type of pesticide. So herbicides kill weeds that we consider pests. Insecticides will kill insects that we consider pests. And fungicides will kill plant diseases that we consider pests. Just like your pool chemicals, those are algicides. Those are pesticides, and in fact are registered by the US EPA. So pesticides must be registered by the US Environmental Protection Agency. And all pesticides, whether they're herbicides, insecticides, algicides, they all go through the same process of registration and regulation. The very minor exception to that is antimicrobial pesticides. They require further data packages just because of the nature of what they're killing and how they're applied. So different pesticides act differently in humans and the environment. So we know that DDT is a terrible chemical, but it's an insecticide. That doesn't mean all insecticides act in exactly the same way. There's different modes of action, there's different modes of toxicity. So you can't make assumptions about one pesticide based on what you know about the other. So they're very varied. And I will also say, with respect to pesticide registration, no state can allow the use of a pesticide unless it is registered by the US EPA. So when I'm talking about Colorado, I'm talking about EPA-approved pesticides. States can register fewer pesticides than what the US EPA registers, but not more. So the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act is the federal law that governs what we can and cannot do with pesticides. And don't be mistaken by the name just because it only mentions insecticides, fungicides, and rodenticides. It covers all pesticides, any side, miticide, algicide, acaricide, all of the sides. So it governs the use of that. It is administered by the EPA, and it is a risk-benefit balancing statute. So I wanted to poll the audience and ask you, what are some of the risks of pesticides?
Toxicity.
Toxicity of people, right? So potential harm to people.
Water.
To water, contamination of water. Those are all risks of pesticides. What could possibly be some of the benefits of pesticides?
Kill the pests.
Why do we care about controlling the pests?
Better crop yields?
Yes, crop yields, right? So people got to eat. And also, I would argue public health, because things like mosquitoes and fleas, they transmit public health. They transmit diseases that cause public health issues. So there are risks to pesticides and there are benefits. And FIFRA is a statute that accepts risk, okay? And what it does is try to balance those so that the risks are not heavier than the benefits. So how do you think these are balanced? What ways do you think that there are to balance these? We know pesticides are toxic because their whole intention is to kill things, right? We know that they're toxic. So what could be the ways that they are balanced? There's no wrong answers. It's not a test. I mean, I'll jump in and give you what I think is the answer. You can argue with me or, provide something else as well. But some of the ways that risks are balanced are things like removing the use of pesticides by certain groups or individuals. So making them restricted. So only people with a pesticide applicator's professional license can use or purchase them or supervise them in some cases. So we remove the use from some people. We reduce the rates. I say we, I'm not actually doing this particular set of work, but I like to use the royal we. So sometimes it's only available for use for a very specific set of crops or sites. So it's basically removing a lot of the uses to reduce the exposure to people. Or sometimes it's adding additional personal protective equipment if the particular risk is to workers, for example. And I forgot my water bottle. Okay. So the goal of FIFRA is not to eliminate the risk of pesticides. It is to mitigate the risk, reduce the risk as much as possible so that the benefits are outweighing the risks. So FIFRA tells EPA that they can register a pesticide if that pesticide is used with commonly recognized practice and care, meaning following all label instructions. It will not cause unreasonable adverse effects on human health and the environment. So if using it according to its directions and using it according to common practice, you cannot reduce or you cannot eliminate unreasonable adverse effects, then it cannot be registered. And I wanted to stop and recognize that I may say the word safe or safety, and the statute of FIFRA says safety all over the place. The 40 CFR says safe and also says unreasonable adverse effects. So I just want to acknowledge that all of those words have a pretty personal definition. So your idea of safe is not necessarily my idea of safe, and that goes with everything. but including pesticides. So I'm acknowledging that, and I don't mean to say pesticides are safe, don't worry. That's not my message. But this is the way EPA views their job in making sure pesticides are used safe and effectively and balancing the risks and the benefits. So the determination of whether or not a pesticide can cause unreasonable adverse effects to humans and the environment is based on a very comprehensive set of scientific assessments. So these are mostly risk assessments. So I'm going to take like a very bird's eye view of registration and risk assessment because I don't want to talk the whole time about it. It is an incredibly complicated and very lengthy process. So there are many steps, many iterations, and many tests involved. So much data generated and collected, and a lot of modeling goes into it. So a risk assessment is the process that EPA will use to evaluate the potential impacts of a pesticide on human health and ecological health. So they identify the hazards and the potential exposure, and then they calculate the overall risk. And they say if the risk is heavier than the benefit, what are some mitigations that we can put into place? And if we can't put in enough mitigations to reduce the risk, then we won't register it. So the two major types of risk assessments are human health and ecological health. And so this is sort of in a nutshell, the process. So there's product characterization studies like, just all of the different chemical properties that you can measure of a pesticide. Human risk characterization, environmental risk characterization, and EPA and pesticide registrants go back and forth on these. There's a standard set of studies, and sometimes depending on the particular risk, there are additional data packages that need to be developed in order for EPA to even consider registering this particular pesticide. And all told, this process takes approximately 6 years. It depends, but it can take 6 years from when a registrant is ready to take their product to market to when it gets its initial registration. So this doesn't account for the time and research and development either. So these are just a listing of some of the studies that can go into a risk assessment, either the human health or the ecological risk assessment. And so I want to talk about residue tolerances. So this is imperative to the human health risk assessment. So this is how EPA calculates how much of each pesticide we are allowed to be exposed to. They use something that's called a reference dose, and it's the maximum amount of chemical that you can be exposed to on a daily basis over the course of your lifetime with no observable adverse effects. So if you can imagine, these studies aren't done on humans. We don't apply pesticides to humans and then, see what happens to them. These are all animal studies. They're all animal studies. I'll just say that. So there's the no observable adverse effects level. Oh, I have a capitalization error, sorry about that. It's the highest dose at which no adverse effects will be seen. So when we look at a test population, I don't do these tests. When you look at a test population, the highest dose that that generation of test animals is exposed to that causes no observable adverse effects, that is the NOAEL. And then they add a 10x safety factor. So a dose is like an amount of pesticide per body weight. So let's say milligrams per kilograms. I'm gonna make up, so if 1 milligram per kilogram is the highest rate that we gave to the test animals and we didn't see any adverse effects, then 10 times that, actually 10 times less than that, is basically divided by 10, because humans and animals test animals aren't the same. And then it's divided by 10 even more, once more, so that to account for the fact that humans are not the same either. I'm gonna react to things differently than you are. I'm allergic to things that other people are not, and vice versa. So if 1 milligram per kilogram is safe for test animals, then that means 100 times less than that is what is generally considered safe for humans. And then certain pesticides or certain situations are maybe more harmful to children. And so if a pesticide is identified as potentially more harmful to children, there's an additional 10x safety factor. And so that all of this shows up on basically on pesticide labels. So what EPA does is basically every single pesticide label, every single use of every single pesticide in the entire United States represented on a label, they assume the maximum amount of rate, the maximum amount of applications to the maximum amount of sites, and then how often you're going to be exposed to that over the course of your lifetime. And presumably, if everybody is using pesticides according to the label and following common practice, and you're exposed to the expected amount of pesticides, you should see no observable adverse effects. I say should, right? Long-term studies, we don't know what happens in the long term, right? We can use our scientific deduction skills, right? We can take data, we can put them in models, we can replicate our data, but there's a lot of things that we just don't know about long-term exposure to anything, okay? And so the reference dose is what I mentioned before. It's the maximum amount of this chemical that you can be exposed to, presumably, and have no adverse effects. And so these risk cups are just a visualization of a reference dose. And so prior to about 1993, each pesticide had its own risk cup. So that's as much chlorpyrifos as you could be exposed to over the whole of your life and not see any adverse effects. And that accounts for all of the uses of chlorpyrifos that were legally allowed at that time. However, we know better, so we do better. All chemically similar chemical families, like similar pesticides that react the same in like a plant, in an animal, and in a human, are grouped. There's a chemical family, for example, called organophosphates. So now all of the organophosphates, I just put 3 of them up there, but there are many of them are no longer registered. They now share a risk cup. And so their risk is looked at in a cumulative way. So you can imagine when the approach to the reference dose or the risk cup changed, many uses of chlorpyrifos, malathion, diazonin, other organophosphates, they got reduced. So many use cancellations because that risk cup initially was overflowing. And so this risk cup, this cumulative risk, is how risk is assessed for all pesticides, so not just organophosphates. So I put a few examples up there. So they're looked at as per their chemical or chemically similar pesticides. They're lumped together. So in addition to that, risk used to only be calculated when they were looking at dietary risk. They were only looking at dietary exposure to like compile like the amount of pesticide that you could be exposed to over the course of your lifetime. It was just dietary exposure. And dietary exposure is estimated to account for about 80% of your pesticide exposure over your lifetime. Residential and water sources account for together about the other 20%. So those are now taken into account. So based on what we know from water quality data, what we know about stormwater runoff, and what we know about residential exposure to pesticides. So residential being in your home. Flea products, tick products on your pet, things like that. So that's called aggregate exposure. So now we look at cumulative exposure, accumulation of a bunch of pesticides together, and also the aggregate exposure. So that aggregate exposure is sort of like overlaid on all of these cumulative risk cups. So I would argue that we currently do a much better job in our country of characterizing the risk because we've taken into account a ton of different exposure scenarios. So a more comprehensive set of exposure scenarios. So this all is part of the risk assessment process. I'm going back to my little roadmap I had there. And then remember how I said if a pesticide was identified as having a particularly harmful risk to children, there was that extra 10x safety factor. So it basically reduces that risk cup significantly. So if children can't be exposed to more than this amount, then nobody can be either, because we can't segregate who's exposed to what. So children are more vulnerable to environmental exposures than adults for a variety of reasons. First, their bodies are smaller, they're still developing, and they eat more, drink more, and breathe more in proportion to their body size. Furthermore, smaller children have this habit of eating the same things like over and over and over again. Think Cheerios, applesauce, cheese sticks. They consume more per capita, right, applesauce than an average adult. And so that's partially why they're more susceptible, right? So a pesticide that's used specifically on apples, they're gonna look way more in depth at that. But also children's behavior, like they crawl on the ground where there are things that other people aren't necessarily exposed to. They put their hands in their mouth and everything. So they are just more vulnerable to environmental exposures in a general sense, and not excluding pesticides, including pesticides. And so that's why risk assessments look more in depth at children and also workers. People who work in the fields, people who apply pesticides are much more vulnerable because they could be directly involved in the pesticide application, and they have more frequent exposure. They just do. And so what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Like what's safe for a worker and what's safe for a child is considered safe for the rest of us. And I say safe in EPA terms. I'm not saying safe in everybody's terms. So I'm not going over this slide. This is too in depth. It's simply a visualization of how complex and iterative the process is, and how many things are taken into consideration when pesticides are being analyzed and reviewed for registration. So I'm not going to talk nearly as much as ecological risk assessments, because human health risk assessments, to me, they're just a little bit more important. I'm not saying ecological risk is not important. I just don't want to talk they're not as complicated. I don't want to talk in as much depth, but they basically look at direct and indirect exposure to the environment caused by pesticides. So when you think the biomagnification effect, so it's not just the harm that one animal could experience because of a pesticide, it's what eats that animal, and what eats that animal. It's, the web of life. So that is taken into consideration as well. So I wanted to see if anybody else had this question, right? So if pesticide companies are either generating these data or they're paying a third-party person to generate these data that are required for these analyses, do you trust it?
So much.
Well, I would, Trace Baker, POSAC.
Yes.
And I would hope that the data before being published are subject to peer review from people not involved with economic interest. And I believe a lot of journals now do require authors to state their economic interest.
Yeah, so Trace, you're right on the right track. So peer review studies are typically what are required. But in addition to that, EPA has scientists. They have PhD toxicologists. They have PhD weed scientists, chemists. They are scientists themselves, and they are public employees. They know nothing to gain from registering or not registering this product. It is simply a scientific process. Is this safe according to our standards, yes or no? There's not, I would argue they do not introduce that bias. So if bias is introduced, they review all of these studies. And then they have this scientific advisory panel. And they also review and approve the processes that EPA scientists use in order to collect data or analyze data, or that they require the registrants to generate the data. So the SAP, or the Scientific Advisory Panel, is made up of outside scientists who have no stake either in the EPA. They're not like a career bureaucrat, nor do they have any financial interest in the pesticide companies. So pesticide labels are the law. When you purchase a pesticide and you use that pesticide, you're essentially entering into a legal contract to follow all of those instructions. Because the label, it's a federally enforceable, it's a federal document, and it's an enforceable document as well. And the label is essentially, oh, I thought I had something else. It's essentially EPA's communication tool to the end user of what they found in the risk assessment, what is and is not allowed based on these complex risk assessments that they have conducted. So I want to take a quick look at how risk identification shows up in pesticide labels. And before I start, I'm using Rejuvra, which is the trade name for indaziflam, and the reason I chose that, to use that as an example, is because I've been hearing a lot about it, either on like the field trip the other day and Scott Nissen's presentation, and in my conversations with Joe. I thought it would be a good one to use. But you will find these similar key information on all pesticide labels. Not always in the right place, not always in the same place. Pesticide labels are a little bit different one from the other. There are certain requirements on a pesticide label. There's no minimum font size on a pesticide label, so they're not necessarily easy to read. But too bad, you have to read them anyways. You have to know exactly what's going on. So this is the front page of the Rejuvra label. And the first thing you see, of course, is the Bayer logo and Rejuvra. Rejuvra, like the marketing name, is the biggest thing on the label. Look how small everything else is. So I would advocate for a larger font size. But one thing upon initial glance that I don't see here is a restricted use pesticide statement. Okay, so that means that it doesn't require all these additional protections. So something could be restricted if it has environmental harm, undue environmental harm, or like acute human toxicity. So like paraquat, gramoxone. That is restricted due to acute human toxicity. Something like atrazine, which I believe is also the trade name, is a restricted use pesticide because it leaches very readily. It's very commonly found in groundwater. And so now it's restricted and you can't use it on sandy soil. So pesticides can be further restricted based on certain factors that come up in these risk assessments. Rejuvra does not happen to be one of those. Another thing that I see is a low toxicity signal word. This word caution, there are caution, warning, and danger are the very specific signal words. Danger sending a stronger message than caution. So it's based on acute human toxicity. It's based on LD50 or LC50 for 4 different routes of exposure. It is pretty specifically speaking to the pesticide applicator. This is the potential harm that, because our pesticide applicators are exposed to concentrated product, they're more at risk than any of us. And so caution, that says to me that's fairly low toxicity. I can look up the LD50, which is the lethal dose to 50% of the test population. And then for inhalation, they would calculate the LC50 lethal concentration for 50% of the test population. It's a measure of how much it takes to kill you, or the test population. So anything that was caused irreversible damage would have a signal word danger or danger poison. So, and caution is 2 steps below that. So these are things that you can, so the LD50 and the LC50 and all these routes of exposure, those go into the human health risk assessment and it spits out a caution, okay? And that's for the applicator. Okay. I also see minimum personal protective equipment, which you would expect to see with the lower toxicity product. I believe that gloves are required. which is kind of an upgrade to the personal protective equipment. It's not the minimum, it's more than the minimum. I don't see any pollinator warnings. So there's no indication of, there's no bee box, which is sometimes on the label, but that's very specific active ingredients. But some other labels will also have statements specifically cautioning you about different types of application that you can and cannot do when pollinators are present. So these are based on the risk assessment. So they do a ecological risk assessment on pollinators. I believe they use honeybees as the proxy, but I wish that you could see this a little bit better. So I dug a little bit deeper and I looked at UCIPM has these bee precaution ratings. So if you went to this website, you could see the publications that they cite. So this was a colleague of mine who developed this database. He spent years working on this, combing the literature for indications of bee toxicity. And let me see if I can read this actually. I know I can't, totally can't. But basically it got a green, right? So it's red, yellow, green are the determinations. And green, which is also 3, is meaning there's no additional pollinator precautions that you need to take with this particular pesticide. It's not known to cause harm to pollinators. There's no, and it's not based on label statements, it's based on data. So it's not like they looked at a label and said, oh, I don't say anything about pollinators. They looked deeper into the literature. So I see in the environmental hazard section that it is toxic to fish, aquatic invertebrates, and plants. I mean, no kidding, it's an herbicide. Of course, it's toxic to plants. But I believe that it means aquatic plants, but still it's an herbicide. So a good number of pesticide labels, I've read hundreds of them, have this statement. So it's toxic to aquatic invertebrates and plants. Toxic to fish and aquatic invertebrates. But also what you'll find on a label are very specific use restrictions that keep you from getting this pesticide in the water. I'm going to blow them up. Do not apply directly to water or to soil where standing water is present, except as specified on this label. And I do not believe there's any specifications on the label. Do not apply in or on irrigation ditches. So this is all as a result of those ecological risk assessments. We know if we can avoid doing these activities, we are very unlikely to harm fish and aquatic invertebrates. If we don't put it in the water, you know, you can't apply it directly to water. There are very few pesticides that you can apply directly to water. There are some. I also see ground and surface water advisories, okay? And so there are further use restrictions to help us avoid that situation. And so the problem seems to be with very light sandy soils, okay? Which sandy soils are prone to leaching anyways, but a pesticide wouldn't leach if the pesticide properties didn't lend themselves to leaching. So it's a combination of soil properties, pesticide properties, and applicator practices that determine whether or not a pesticide will move off-site with the water. And so I also looked, my husband's a soil scientist, so I asked him for a little bit of help. So he looked up the soil map for me for Rabbit Mountain. So the overview map is over on this side. And then if you go to the right-hand side, it talks about the specific soil types. So I think the pointer will work. Okay. So this is the overall soil type. And all of these are like to the right of it, to my right of it, are the subsoil types. So the percentage of all of these 5 add up to 100%. And so the overall soil type is baller. Now you're gonna need a soil scientist to translate some of this stuff, but I'm gonna pick out some key words that I do know. So it's a loamy, skeletal, mixed, superactive, mesic, lithic haplostol. And the pedons are very stony, fine, sandy loam, grassland. And then it goes on to describe even where exactly it is. It's really interesting. But what I see is that it's loamy and a sandy loam. So a loam is You know, a sand is more sand than anything else. A clay soil is more clay than anything else. And a loam is somewhere in between. So you wouldn't want to apply this on a very sandy soil. So it's got some sand in there, and it's pretty shallow soil. As a matter of fact, you're going to hit bedrock really fast. But you would also need to know if you have an aqueduct underneath you. Do you have a confined aquifer? I mean, an aquifer is what I meant to say. Do you have a confined aquifer, semi-confined aquifer? These things will also help you determine if a pesticide is going to get into your groundwater. So I'm telling you, I'm advocating for everybody to read and follow all of the label instructions, because those are based on risk assessments. But I would also advocate, it's always a good idea, especially if you love the place where you're applying pesticides, which it seems like everybody here does. You need to use best practices as well. So identify your soil more specifically than just, it's a loam, it's fine. Oh, the soil map says this. Go take a soil sample, you know what I mean? And like figure out where your aquifer is, figure out where nearby surface water is, and pay close attention to these things. So I also looked a little bit further into this, and I went to the herbicides properties tool, and it was developed by the National Pesticide Information Center, which is housed at Oregon State University, and it's actually funded by a cooperative agreement with EPA to provide pesticide information to anybody who wants it. But they have this really cool tool called the Herbicide Properties Tool. You can look up an herbicide active ingredient and figure out the water solubility, the vapor pressure, and it gives you a determination of, is it like, it's not very soluble, it's not likely to move in water, or whatever, for any of the pesticides that you would use, what the vapor pressure is, because that's an indication that it might volatilize and move off site as a vapor. They calculate the groundwater ubiquity score and give you some determinations based on soil type. So you got a soil half-life. Oh boy, I wish I could see this a little bit better. I'm gonna see if I can zoom it on my screen. But I think the soil half-life, if I'm not mistaken, is like 130 in days in sandy soil, which is fairly persistent. And so, you know, there's good and bad to having persistent pesticides. What is the good news about a persistent pesticide?
Need less.
You need less of it, and you only have to apply it once, usually, because it's still active where you've put it. It's not moving, you know. But of course, if you had some sort of like tumultuous soil erosion event, that pesticide is still in that soil that gets eroded. So there's good and bad to having persistent pesticides. And then I think I did these out of order, but there are many more label statements we can go over. There are so many more data in the risk assessment that you could look very specifically at. But the point I want to make is the translation of those risks that are characterized in the risk assessment are found in the label instructions and the label statements. So applicators, if they're following all of these instructions and they know about the environment and they're paying attention to the weather, for example, they can avoid a lot of environmental contamination and exposure to people who should not be exposed to pesticides. So steps that should be taken to reduce the risk of pesticides is to read and follow all label instructions. I didn't add best management practices here. I meant to and I forgot. Have licensed applicators making the application. They are required to have a lot more training. They have to study and take a test and get recertification credits every 3 years, and they're much more likely to be inspected by the state. So have a licensed applicator. Do not enter, if you're a person of the public or not participating in the application, do not enter fields or areas where pesticides have been applied. If there's a sign up saying don't enter because of pesticides, don't go in there. There's a very specific reason for that. And I would caution people to stay at least 100 feet away from aerial sprays. And what I mean is 100 feet away from where that spray is intended to go, stay 100 feet away. And that's based on, that's just based on a rule in agricultural systems for how far away workers should stay away from different sprays or intended to stay away from them. And so I thought it was just a good rule of thumb. So I have just a couple more slides. I thought I could suggest how maybe Boulder County or POSAC itself could approach herbicide use decisions on public lands. It's a very contentious issue. Pesticides provide a lot of benefits for us, but there are risks affiliated and associated with their use. So I had the opportunity to attend the field day on Tuesday, and Carrie handed out this sort of a diagram of the wicked problem that is pesticides. And the only thing I changed here were just the colors, but also in the center, she had put draft weed management, but I specifically added pesticides because that's what we're talking about. So there are different things. These are all interests or things that are important to consider when determining if you're going to apply a pesticide. And they could be competing interests, right? So, you know, if we want to reduce the amount of pesticide applications, maybe we can have people hand pulling. But then we have more labor costs, and we also have some ergonomic issues potentially with our labor force, right? So we need to take care of the people who are working out in the fields for us, not just with pesticide exposure, but like any of the other hazards that they may face in the field. So that's a consideration. I'm sort of driven by, I'm a people-focused issue type person, and so that's what I key in on first. So when I was at the University of California, I had the opportunity to sit on something called the SPOC, the System-Wide Pesticide Oversight Committee, and we were writing a pesticide policy for the entire system of the University of California. That included all 10 campuses, the Division of Ag and Natural Resources where I worked, and the health systems and the forest reserves. So they were writing a policy, an integrated pest management policy, and then I came in to help with the pesticide portion of that. So prior to being asked to be on the SPOC, there was an herbicide task force called by the university president, who was Janet Napolitano at the time. And she actually called a glyphosate task force, and they renamed themselves the Herbicide Task Force because I thought they should be looking at all herbicides and not just glyphosate. And this was prompted by a bunch of probably political conditions and political climate happening at the time in California. But definitely the University of California was like, are we going to get sued because we use glyphosate around students who are young people? Maybe we should think about this. And so what we were doing was we took, okay, there are various groups who have done something similar, but the city and county of San Francisco, which are one and the same, they came up with, for their pest managers, a reduced risk pesticide list. And what they did was establish a very specific set of criteria. And every single pesticide, basically, that was registered, they evaluated by that criteria, like acute toxicity, I can't read what it says, but it has something to do with acute toxicity, chronic toxicity, groundwater contamination, detections in water, restricted use pesticide, right? So they identified all these they came up with this list of characteristics that you could measure or determine for every pesticide, and they did that for every pesticide. And they came up with the good, the bad, the ugly, right? So the red, yellow, green list. Okay, and so then they made basically made decisions on pesticide use based on what tier it fell into, whether it was a red, a yellow, or green. And so at the University of California, what the Herbicide Task Force had decided to do in the SPOC, which I was a part of, got to sort of implement, was we took their list of criteria and we added a couple of our own. One of the particular things that we added was they had federally restricted use pesticide would make something in the red tier, and we thought that we should add state restricted pesticide because in California, they further restrict certain active ingredients that are not restricted federally. They go a little bit further. So we thought, well, the state has already determined that there's something wrong with these pesticides. We need to put them on the red list. So we came up with a red, yellow, and green list, and then it was up to the individual campuses to we made sort of like system-wide rules, but a lot of negotiation could happen on the campuses based on their unique situation. Just as with open space, you know, maybe Rabbit Mountain has different unique circumstances than another piece of property that is not contiguous with it. So basically what we decided was anything that was red, you couldn't use it without some sort of an exemption. One exemption would be like a standing exemption because, for example, boric acid, according to Global Harmonized System of Identifying Acute or Chronic Toxicity, one of the GHS measures, boric acid came up looking really bad. But boric acid is very often used in ant baits. So no pesticide applicator is really exposed to it. It kind of goes in the corner and it never gets sprayed. So we had a standing exemption for boric acid ant baits. But then we would have time-limited exemptions for other things. And one example that I could give you of that is there was a forest preserve, a forest area outside of the Berkeley campus, and they were dealing with poison oak. So poison oak is a public health issue. This is trails, people are out there walking, and they had tried other methods of removal. It's difficult to remove poison oak without exposing the workers. And so they had tried a different pest and a different herbicide as well, and it just wasn't working. So they requested a time-limited exemption to use glyphosate on a very directed spray, very specific area, and they were granted that exemption. So it was like kind of like judging the pesticides and then negotiating the terms under which they could be used in a very thoughtful, locally specific type of way. So you could come up with your own criteria based on what is on here, like what is important to Boulder County. These things can all be found out about pesticides. There's so many databases, peer-reviewed studies that you could dig into. So you could take the city and county of San Francisco's list, their criteria list. There's another group led by a former colleague at Oregon State called the Highly Hazardous Pesticides. So they used a slightly different set of criteria. And you could, and lots of people have taken these criteria and modified them. So, I mean, something that you could look at is the number of applications necessary. The more applications you do, the more potential exposure you have to your workers because of drift, because of a variety of things. You could look at the use rate. So I looked at the use rate of Rejuvera. It was 5 to 7 fluid ounces per acre. That is very low. That is a very small use rate to be effective. So that's less of the pesticide that you have to put out to be effective. So you could analyze different pesticides by their use rate. You could look at worker safety, so acute toxicity, PPE that's required, what the application method is. Sometimes when you're out with the backpack sprayer and tromping through uneven terrain, that's not necessarily a pesticide exposure issue, but it is a worker safety issue. The likelihood for the pesticide to move off-site based on your site conditions, based on your weather patterns, and based on the chemical characteristics. The efficacy, how well it works. That's important, and a lot of people add in resistance concerns because they don't want pesticide resistance because that doesn't help anybody. Is there an alternative available actually viable alternative available? And you could also look at application equipment use. These are just things off the top of my head that I thought you could consider putting on your list of criteria. Somebody could think of putting on their list of criteria. So I guess I would say EPA has like a very extensive process for ensuring safety, assuming everybody does what they're supposed to. However, you don't have to accept that that's good enough for you. You could go further and make further determinations on pesticides based on a list of criteria that you think that these pesticides should live up to for them to be worthy of you, I guess. And with that, I would just take any questions.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions from POSAC? Paula?
Yeah, Paula Fitzgerald. I just have one to start, and you said that that basically the list can be added to, or the restrictions added to over time, and I presume that's because of longer-term studies that have found some bad properties with it. So anyway, how long-term are the studies? It said 6 years from start to finish on the review, but you know, I mean, certain things accumulate over time and become more toxic, especially in combination with other things. So just You can add to that.
So to clarify, you referring to the risk assessments and how that registration process is a 6-year process. What I forgot to mention is that EPA will re-evaluate or re-register, redetermine if they're going to re-register a pesticide at least every 15 years. And so they'll require an additional data package. They can shorten that time frame if there are incidents. So incidents or some things going on. So like dicamba recently, I'm sorry, I'm not going to, there soybeans that are dicamba-ready soybeans. Basically, you can spray dicamba and herbicide over the top of soybeans, and it kills the weeds and not the soybeans. Well, there were volatility issues, not entirely sure what exactly was happening, and so EPA took a re-look at that pesticide, that particular pesticide registration, to try and address some of those issues. There's also pesticide illness reporting. Not every state has mandatory pesticide illness reporting. For example, in California, they did, and it has an extensive database of pesticide exposures. Many of them are bleach because people put bleach in a water bottle and put it under their bathroom sink, and then people mistake it for something else. But they had agricultural exposures too, other occupational exposures. So, so there are various states who have these pesticide illness reporting databases, but other types of required pesticide illness reporting, they also get poison control reports. So if there's incidents like human health incidents or widespread drift incidents, or paraquat was reevaluated because a lot of people were it's highly acutely toxic. It'll kill you instantly, and people were dying instantly from drinking it, whether purposefully or not, I'm not sure. Anyway, so these incidents, things happen, or like some things known to leach, or it's like very frequently being found to move off site, they will reevaluate more frequently than that 15-year cycle.
And just to follow up on that, does Colorado have this pesticide illness reporting? No.
No, you can report you can report it. It's not required, and physicians can report, but I don't know how much education is done for physicians to know how to report or what to look for. But no, Colorado is not one of those states.
Thank you, Carol.
Carol Byerly. I just want to thank you, Lisa, and because this is the kind of information that I was looking for, that gives us options and gives us a little more depth, and gives us some frameworks to understand what our options are, because we're at a crossroads. I'm wondering if you can give us your slides or send them to Renata, and we can have your slides, because I think some of those lists are.
Sure. I would be happy to share my slides. I would probably put a few more citations in there before I share them with you, because some of them are just screenshots, and you wouldn't be able to follow the link to what I was trying to lead you to. It's a long story. His name is Miguel. He was a graduate student at UC Davis, and I had somebody working for me, and we were working on this great project, a field worker training kit. And I was like, we need a picture of a person, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. She's like, I got somebody. And so oftentimes when I would travel around California with Miguel, they'd be like, oh, that looks like this guy I went to Cal Poly with. And I was like, that is the guy that you went to Cal Poly with.
Tony.
Tony Lewis-Bosak, thanks for a great presentation.
Sure.
Super clear and very helpful. I'm curious because I hear about provisional approval by EPA on some pesticides, or conditional approval, or we haven't done the full studies yet, but we're allowing the use of this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I can. Yeah, thank you for that question. So let me think of an example. So there are different kinds of more like conditional or emergency types of registrations that they can do. So one is called a 24C. It's just the section of FIFRA, but it's a special local needs. And that's not really provisional necessarily, but it's more like it's already a registered product, and it has a tolerance established. So a tolerance is the maximum amount of residues that you can be exposed to on a peach, for example, and all calculated into that risk cup in the reference dose. And so a special local needs would be, we don't want to add a national registration. It's registered on peaches, for example, but not on nectarines. And in Idaho, they want to use it in nectarines. And there's only a couple of valleys in Idaho that commercially grow nectarines. So it's a very small local area. And so they don't want to add a national registration because that might increase the risk cup above, it might get the risk cup to be a little bit too full. But if they can restrict it only to the Magic Valley and the Treasure Valley in Idaho, nobody else is allowed to use it on nectarines. So that's kind of a special registration. There's something called a Section 18, which is considered an emergency exemption. And so that is something where I believe it's the state that has to prove a true economic loss type of an emergency, where let me take a step back. So a pesticide registrant is in this process of registering that particular pesticide for that particular use. But it hasn't cleared all of the paperwork yet, but an increasing pest condition has arisen. So Section 18s, I don't pay as much attention to them anymore, but back when I was in Idaho, there were, for Mormon crickets, there were Section 18 pesticides. And so many, if not all of the studies had been done. It was just a matter of you have to be a certain way through the process in order for a Section 18 to even be allowed. And it's really kind of up to the state to kind of negotiate with EPA. So that is an emergency exemption. So yeah, it hasn't gone all the way through the process. There are experimental use permits, and I don't know actually how common that is. I mean, in California, there were hardly any experimental use permits because we had a particular policy with the state that said we didn't need one. We had a state policy. And basically that allows somebody like me or somebody at the university to do research on a product either that doesn't have a registration yet, so it's a numbered compound, it doesn't even have, a trade name or anything like that, to get efficacy data or to harvest it to send it off for residue testing, all these kinds of things. So it would be either a numbered product, or it could be something where we want a national label for nectarines, but it's registered on peaches. And so just making sure that the residue chemistry adds up to, to what it should or whatever. So or if you wanted to do new application methods, or if you wanted to increase the rate above what the label says. So anytime you're going off label or you don't have a label, that's an experimental use. And so there are certain things that you have to do when you do experimental uses. So for a permanent crop, is it just a permanent? Basically, you have to destroy the crop that you've applied that experimental pesticide to. You can't feed it to the cows, you can't feed it to the pigs, because then people eat these animals. So they have to be just destroyed, burned, or just completely destroyed, or I don't know, tilled under, sometimes they would be. So yeah, that's an experimental use pesticide. It's not registered for that particular use. I think that's all that I can think of.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. More questions? Drew?
Yeah, Drew Adams, Bozak. Thanks so much. Very informative. I'm just kind of thinking a little bit about the chart of risk assessment of different pesticides that San Francisco County and city put together, and thinking about what would be the longevity for Boulder County to put something like that together, as far as an assessment of all the items that are being used, and develop something comparative.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say, so it was a huge undertaking for them. And then even at the University of California, when we were trying to do our own with the additional criteria, there were a lot of people working on it. I mean, I just was saying, you need to do this and that, and then other people were doing it that I wasn't paying. So it was sort of a huge undertaking, but I would argue that, at least in Boulder County on the open space, you're using a much smaller suite of pesticides than what is available to everybody. So you could start with a narrower suite. And so you wouldn't have to analyze every single pesticide according to those criteria. I will say, like the city and county of San Francisco, the person who sort of spearheaded that effort retired and was hoping to like farm the management of this list out to somebody else. I don't know if there was just nobody at his agency, like in the city, who could take it over with that expertise, but it was like this database that needed to be managed, and I know he was looking for a home for it. So I would say it is quite an undertaking, but you don't have to take on the whole universe of what's registered in the state and analyze them, but it would be like a large suite of pesticides initially, and then as new ones became available or were proposed for use, then you could analyze that as well. Yeah, I mean, it would take somebody with some expertise in digging through the data, but I had to say I worked with like the software group. The University of California had the software group. It was wild, but somebody who didn't know a whole lot about pesticides, with a little bit of guidance, they were just hammering away at it. So it is an undertaking. It would take, resource allocation to at least the initial development. And then a lot of meetings and negotiation and discussion back and forth, because you may have a different list depending on the site because of the specific characteristics. It's really close to homes, or it's, some site characteristic that may be unique. So yeah, it's a lot of work, but you wouldn't have to do you wouldn't have to do the whole universe. Yeah.
So it sounds like potentially a few doctorate candidates at CSU might be interested in launching this under your guidance.
Oh, well, maybe with some funding.
Yeah. Okay.
They don't give you students for free, I tell you what.
Okay, thank you. Any other POSAC comments, Christine?
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Christine.
So I'm really curious. I think it's interesting that some of these places are choosing to do an additional layer of restriction on top of the EPA process, and it makes me wonder what you might think are the holes in the EPA approval process. So I think we hear about in the popular press about various pesticides that many years after they were approved, we begin to understand them better and some of the risks about them. And I realized, I appreciate that what you said earlier, that it's not about risk elimination, that it's about balancing. And I get that not every test under the sun can be run. My bias is that I think that not a lot has been done on what happens to soil biota. I'm a recovering soil scientist myself. And that is the impacts on soil are not really assessed. So what do you think are the drawbacks of the federal approval process? And if you were the one running this, what kinds of risks would you be considering in a county program?
I will have to look into your soil question about how much they look at the soil microbial community. I'm very curious about that.
I mean the fauna as well.
Okay. Thank you. I'll write that down in a minute. But I would argue that a drawback in this process is it's just hard to know chronic issues and multiplier issues or cumulative type issues. I mean, they do look at active ingredients alone. Also, like they do the risk assessments according to like the combination of active ingredients that are likely to be applied together, but we're exposed to a ton of chemicals in our environment that are not pesticides. I don't know what the interaction is between those. They could have some sort of synergistic effect. I mean, I don't know, I'm making this up, but we don't look at that, right? So you don't look at pesticides along with fertilizers, right? Because they're applied together often. So I think that's it's like the vacuum nature of the studies that are done. And it's just also hard to look at long-term, even though you do they do tests on multiple generations of test animals, they simply don't live as long as we do. And so, I think the chronic piece is missing, or is difficult. It's difficult to do, and probably not done as well as it could be, yeah.
And a follow-up on that, adjuvants are not included in the approval process, right? So inactive ingredients that are in many of the formulations, right? Or even combinations?
They do look at the other ingredients. They don't publish those. Those are like confidential business information, so they don't like publish them. But they do look at them. I don't believe they get as much scrutiny as the active ingredients. I will say that at least in California, I believe New York, and perhaps another state, the adjuvants that you add after the fact, like add to the tank a sticker, spreader, whatever, those are required to be registered actually in certain states. And in California, they will, like EPA can register a pesticide, but they register the pesticide in California itself. They go through their own process after EPA has gone through their process. So they do that with the adjuvants. But yeah, those other ingredients that are not the active ingredients are looked at. They don't talk about them as much. They can't talk about the individual ingredients because it's confidential, but they do run the risk assessments on them as well. I was going to say another drawback and I forgot what it was. Sorry. And then I think you asked another question about maybe the criteria.
If you were going to do this, what criteria would you look at for Boulder County?
Well, I mean, these are things that came to the top of my head. This is not a complete list, but I would, I know money and budgets are important, and I'm not going to discount that, but also worker issues, I feel like, because our workers are more exposed to pesticides than other people in the environment or other people, in our communities. So I would pay particular attention to what's safest for workers, and not just pesticide exposure, like heat illness, for example. If they have to wear a lot of personal protective equipment, that increases their risk for heat-related illness. Let me see, I guess. So, I mean, this is probably a place where I would start, but I don't believe that this is a comprehensive list.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Jackson?
Jackson Moeller with PostAc. Wonderful presentation, so thank you. I think I want to ground myself as well as the panel. For me, it looked like on that one slide, the center of the solar system was pesticide. And for me, the goal is a healthy ecosystem and healthy human health. And it feels like we're talking about like, how do we use pesticides safely? And for me, it's like, how do we treat these weeds? And so like the alternatives are something that I just it's more of a comment than a question, but the slide was, pesticide.
So I changed the slide to add that pesticide. It was just draft weed management. And I want to say, I'm here to talk about pesticides because that's what I was asked to talk about. I don't want to ignore the cultural controls, the non-chemical controls that I know that Boulder County staff are implementing on open space land. I would argue you kind of have to look at those, there's, like tillage, great for managing weeds, is really terrible for soil moisture. You know what I mean? So you might want to do a little bit of an analysis for every single one of the methods that you would look at. And it sounded to me from what my conversations with Boulder County staff and what I learned on the field trip is that they are doing integrated approaches. But my area of my subject matter expertise happens to be pesticides, and so that's what I focused on. So I don't want to ignore the fact that there are alternatives to pesticides, but when you do decide to make that pesticide application, it's really important to think about all these factors too.
Thank you. Paula?
And Lisa, thank you for this. This is super helpful. And I have a question actually probably more for county staff, which is, first, is everyone who's applying pesticides certified with an applicator's license? Yeah, okay. Okay. And how widely used, how much do you try to stick to integrated pest management using the lowest pesticide possible and other means as much as you can?
It's always part of the consideration. Depends on the site and a lot of different considerations, but like, for example.
Could you please come up and use the mic?
I'm Malcolm Wiley, and I do the roadside vegetation management for the county. And so just for an example, like I'll use a combination of methods a lot of times. So like where we have a large population of spotted knapweed on a roadside, I'll go and pull all of the plants that will pull easily. And then there's plants that just don't pull out of the ground. And so I reduce a lot of the vegetative material that's actually there. So when I go to apply the pesticide, I'm using the least amount that I can. So a small example, but it's really site dependent. So, but we're always trying to use all the methods that we can use.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Yes,
Derek Turner, POSAC, and a follow-up question. Is that kind of your practice or department guidance? Is it documented somewhere? And what's the broader
I don't know
policy?
that that's specifically in the policy. It's probably something that we're looking at, having that language in there.
Thanks.
anything else from POSAC? Lisa, I do have one question as Trace Baker, POSAC, and thank you for very detailed presentation. And when you do send your slides to Renata, I certainly would be another one who would appreciate more citations. But my question, you talked about how all states are required to register pesticide use, and you talked about differences among some states. So does Colorado do anything, unusual, specific, more or less cautious? And how does that apply to other jurisdictions like county, local?
Sure. Thanks for that question. So to clarify, no state can register a pesticide that isn't registered by EPA.
Okay.
And some states register a pesticide as in they approve it for use in their state. So they review some of the material. They don't typically repeat their risk assessments like they do in California. So they take a second look at the label to make sure there's enforceable language on it and not vague language or what have you. So they'll take a closer look at that. So I would say Colorado takes like a moderate approach to looking at these labels. Not everything registered by EPA is registered here in Colorado. And there is a specific registration person at the Colorado Department of Ag, so she'll review the labels that come in. I will say there's one group of pesticides that's called, EPA calls them minimum risk, and they're listed in section 25B of FIFRA. Is it 25B of FIFRA? Anyways, they're called 25B, so 25B means something, but they're deemed minimum risk, and they're things like cinnamon oil, putrescent egg white solids, dried blood. These are substances that are naturally occurring who could have some pesticidal properties that are not required by EPA to be registered because they are minimum risk. And some of them, canola oil, could be food use or something like that. There's a very specific list of these ingredients. So EPA just doesn't register them. It doesn't require their registration. You can imagine a chemical company or a company wanting to sell these products and make all kinds of unsubstantiated claims that they work really well and they're safe and they're all this. But EPA doesn't really regulate them. And some states do. So Colorado is one of those states where they have to submit a label. The claims have to be reasonable and verifiable. So Colorado does go one step further than EPA with respect to these minimum risk pesticides. They can't make unsubstantiated or, untenable claims. And then as far as just pesticide regulation in general, Colorado gets guidance from EPA, for example, on how to certify or license their applicators. And then they take the minimum requirements, they add a bunch of stuff, they mix it all around, and then you have our certification process here in Colorado. So they've met a minimum standard, but they go above and beyond based on our specific, specific scenario here in Colorado, or the political will to have more regulation or fewer or what have you. So the Colorado Department of Ag is granted primacy by EPA. So they have primary enforcement responsibility in the state of Colorado. So that includes managing the certification plan for pesticide applicators. And they go out and they have inspectors that go out and inspect people who use restricted use pesticides, or, have a own, whatever, like a variety of people that have interaction with pesticides. There are certain enforcement or inspections that they are required to do, a certain number of inspections. So in that way, Colorado will sort of take federal guidance and add their own flavor, I'll say, and then enforce it across the entire state. So City and County of Boulder have to follow EPA requirements, Colorado requirements, and county and city requirements. So you have multiple layers there.
So then, if Boulder County would choose to, we can be more aggressive in conditions we put on pesticide use than the state requires?
You do have the authority on land that's owned by Boulder County, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Anything more from POSAC? Okay, Lisa, thank you very much.